Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. I wish you a very warm welcome back to the Center for International Relations in Sustainable Development. We are now in the 10th year of our work here in Serbia and around the world. We are continuing with our mission, and that is to help the Balkans make a better sense of what is going on in the world. I remember 10 years ago when there was a founding event in Belgrade. We did have a very special guest, the guest that is our guest as well of this evening, one of the founding members of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. But tonight we're here to celebrate the coming out of print of the 22nd volume of our journal, Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development, which in the meantime, I'm very proud to say, has become the only Southeast Europe's academic publication that is available on JSTOR, which is a big deal, and we're very proud of it. Of course, thanks to the range of great authors that have been writing for us, including in this issue, the 22nd volume, which speaks about the winter of our discontent. The winter of dissatisfaction, the winter of locomotion throughout the world. But I'm going to say a few words at this stage about our guest of tonight. And I am not going to make an exaggeration if I say that what Novak Djokovic is for tennis, Jeffrey Sachs is for sustainable development. And that's simply the greatest of all times. I was enormously privileged to have Jeffrey Sachs as my mentor in graduate school. He was my mentor at Harvard. He, at the age of 26, joined Harvard faculty. At the age of 28, he became tenured professor. If I'm not mistaken, the youngest tenured professor at that time in Harvard's history. New York Times called him probably the most important economist in the world. He's a world-renowned intellectual, best-selling author, innovative educator, and widely recognized for bold and effective strategies to address complex challenges, including escape from extreme poverty, the global battle against human-induced climate change, and so on. He's currently university professor at Columbia University, where he's also the director of the Center for Sustainable Development. He is also president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences at the Vatican. Jeffrey Sachs served as advisor to 3 consecutive Secretary Generals of the United Nations, to Kofi Annan, to Ban Ki-moon, and then to Antonio Guterres. He also served as an advisor to a president of the UN General Assembly in 2012 and 2013. I was privileged to have Jeffrey Sachs as my advisor. I was also privileged to have Jeffrey Sachs on my side as a senior member of my campaign team when I ran for Secretary General in 2016. He's the author of numerous books, some of which did become global bestsellers. He's the recipient of the 2022 prestigious Tang Prize in Sustainable Development. And there's so many things I can say about Jeff, but this is the one last piece that I'm going to say. He received 41 honorary doctorates from universities around the world. So when I compare him to Novak Djokovic's 22 Grand Slam titles, I did have this statistic in mind. So 41 times honorary doctorate for our guest of tonight. And last but not least, he was the chairman of Lancet Commission. Lancet, one of the most famous scientific journals in the world, created a big commission on the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, which is something that I'm sure we're going to touch upon in our conversation tonight. So without further ado, I ask you to join me in warm welcome our guest of tonight, Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Wow. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Vuk. It's wonderful to be back here because we've had fantastic discussions over the last 10 years here. And please know how incredibly innovative CIRSD is and how incredibly foresighted it was of Vuk to put together the two themes of international relations and sustainable development. He had a little bit of an inside track because he led for the whole world the Sustainable Development Initiative, which brought us the Sustainable Development Goals, so that's quite a historic contribution. But Vuk knew then, as a world-leading diplomat engaged in sustainable development, that success in saving the planet was going to depend on success of geopolitics. And whether we can be successful is still hanging in the balance. So we came together, you invited me kindly 10 years ago in this forum, this venue, where we celebrated your idea of launching CIRSD and this publication. Then a year after that, we discussed one of the most poignant and difficult topics in modern history, and that was the origins of World War I, something that this region knows all too well. And of course, the backdrop of that discussion that we had in 2014 was, can we avoid sleepwalking into disaster again in the 21st century? And who would have thought that we would be meeting again this evening when that question is actually front and center for the whole world, because I think it's a backdrop to our discussion, just one very sobering point, and I'm eager to speak with you tonight about it. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which many of you will have heard of, in 1947 established something called the Doomsday Clock, which is also called the minutes to midnight clock. And the idea of these atomic scientists was that they knew back in 1947 that they had, through the brilliance of their science, created something that for the first time in human history could really destroy humanity. And they sensed that it was a danger unlike anything that humanity had ever experienced before, because while humanity is able to kill each other in large numbers and has done so throughout history, having a weapon that could end the planet was something different. And so they made this doomsday clock. And when they launched it in 1947, they put it at 7 minutes to midnight, 7 minutes to disaster. And over the years since 1947, the clock has generally moved a little closer to midnight because the weapons became more and more powerful. And because a few years ago they told the world that it's not just nuclear war, but it's environmental catastrophe that could also doom humanity. But at some points, such as the end of the Cold War, the hand was moved back from midnight several minutes. And for me, that's very poignant because what we're going to discuss tonight in my professional life started 34 years ago when I became an advisor in this region to Ante Markovic in federal Yugoslavia in 1989, and to the Solidarity Movement in Poland, and to Mikhail Gorbachev, his economic team for the Soviet Union. And We thought then, 30 plus years ago, that the tensions would be reduced, and that Gorbachev, who for me is a hero, even though he's reviled by many in his own country, I think through a deep misunderstanding, but in any event, for me he's a hero because he was a person of peace. And maybe that's in a way why the Soviet Union ended, because he did not want to use force to hold things together. He wanted to use persuasion. But be that as it may, his idea was that there could be a peaceful, common European home. That was his great idea. And I signed up for that. I thought that really is a wonderful idea and a wonderful way to spend one's effort and one's time. And I got stuck with that idea 34 years ago, and I'm still completely stuck with it today. So I'm deeply frustrated by what's happening. And what we're going to discuss a bit is how we got from those very optimistic days to today. But just to make the point, what was 7 minutes to midnight in 1947, and then was, I think, 12 or even more minutes to midnight when they put the hands back further from disaster, is now, as of last week, 90 seconds to midnight. What the scientists are saying to us is a minute and a half to disaster. And what they're conveying by their announcement last week is that we are on the threshold of nuclear war, again, for the first time in 60 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in some ways more ominous now even than 60 years ago, because there's a hot war to start with. And this is a war between the United States and Russia, have no doubt, even though the soldiers dying in Ukraine are Ukrainian soldiers. The weapon systems and the intelligence and the sighting and the finance is all the United States and its allies. So this is a war between Russia and the United States already. And you don't want that between two nuclear superpowers. So that's the kind of grim occasion that we meet this evening.
So, well, thank you, Jeff, for this introduction. And as a matter of fact, I was planning on asking you this as a first question, because this is obviously the biggest issue that is dominating the world headlines, and that is occupying most of the energy and oxygen in a room when you talk about the world politics. But you did remind me of this big event that we organized together in 2014 on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. And there were people, including Christopher Clark, who was our guest back then, who claimed that that the First World War actually started by the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo, and obviously others gave it a little bit of a different perspective, that there was a bigger issue at stake. So I'm going to use this as a way to enter my first question: the war in Ukraine, the war between the United States, as you say, and Russia, the proxy war that is being fought on the territory of Ukraine. How do you see the origins of this conflict? How did we get here? Why are we on the precipice of a disaster, 90 seconds from midnight on the doomsday clock, if you will?
Yeah, I think it's exactly the right analogy. When did World War I start? Did it start on June 28th with the assassination of the Archduke? Did it start on July 28th with the declaration of war by Austria against Serbia? Did it start 10 years earlier when military alliances were secretly made that led to the triggering of disaster? Of course, there are roots to any conflict. And even the dating that we give to the Ukraine war in most of the Western media is simply false on its surface, but it also disguises the antecedent causes. This war started in February 2014. We say it started in February 2022, typically, that Putin, without provocation, because he's a madman and wanted to recreate the Russian Empire in his fantasies, launched an unprovoked war on February 24th, 2022. That's just propaganda. That's not even factual about when the fighting started, because the fighting started in 2014, not in 2022, and it raged, actually, between 2014 and 2022. So even the simple fact of when the war started was that it started 8 years earlier. And of course, why the war started 8 years earlier is heavily contested, but I'll give you my 5-minute view, and that is that from 1990 onward, we failed to endorse, adopt, and build on Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, and instead the US set up a vision of a US-led unipolar world and believed that the Cold War was won by a US victory rather than achieved by a diplomatic settlement. In fact, the US did not defeat the Soviet Union. Gorbachev unilaterally said we should end the Cold War. We want to reform. We're going to disband the Warsaw Pact because we don't want to address our issues through military means. And he was told in 1990, okay, if you do that, Germany wants to reunify, but we commit to not expanding our military alliance, NATO, in place of what was the Warsaw Pact. And a famous promise was made that we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And by the way, I always like to say in my talks, if you want documentary evidence, my email is sachs@columbia.edu, and I'll be happy to refer you to the archival material that documents this, because this is all denied now by the United States, which likes a politics of amnesia rather than a politics of memory in this case. So the US promised no NATO enlargement. By 1992, the neoconservatives in the United States, which means the hawkish or war party, was in power. Remember Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, and then they were followed by the Democratic Party side of the war party, which is Madeleine Albright, Richard Holbrooke, and others. So it's both parties. It's not one party or another party. They said, no, we won. It's a unipolar world. Anyway, Soviet Union's finished. We don't have any commitments to keep. And so Bill Clinton started the NATO enlargement in the mid-1990s. And really smart people knew at the time, this is reckless. This is dangerous. It's a cheat, and it's also a provocation. And so that went on for a long time. By the way, when President Putin came to power in 1999, he was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. He expected cooperation. But he said, stop the NATO enlargement because, you know, we have interests and we don't want your military on our border. Then came 9/11. The neocons went into absolute preeminence. Cheney basically ran the security state of the United States from 2001 to 2008. He was a very dangerous person. He said if there's 1% risk of something, you have to treat it like it's 100% chance. You know, if Saddam has 1% chance of having nuclear weapons, you have to treat it like it's certainty. That's a little crazy, by the way, in decision analysis. You don't treat a 1% as 100%, but you do create a lot of wars if you do that. So all the wars started. And the NATO enlargement continued in 2004, 7 more countries. The Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And then in 2007, Putin said, no more. So George W. Bush in 2008 said, yes, more. Ukraine and Georgia. This was not prudent. Prudence, prudentia, is a Latin word meaning practical good judgment. And it comes from a Greek word called sophrosony, which means wisdom. This is not wisdom. This is stupid. And that's what they announced in Bucharest 2008. And many European leaders said to me at the time, what is he doing? We're against this. But one thing, this is the continuing slide into this, and I'll just finish with 2 quick points on this. In 2014, the US helped overthrow the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. We know it from many means. I know it because I happen to see things that I wish I hadn't seen. But the US was part of this overthrow. Putin didn't like that either, because Yanukovych was actually rather cleverly trying to balance 2 giants. On the one side, the West saying you must do this and you must do that. On the other side, Russia saying you must do this and must do that. And Yanukovych's position was, we're neutral, thank you, we're neutral. That was rather intolerable to the United States. Neutrality doesn't work in the US mindset, because you're either with us or you're against us. And so they helped to overthrow him in February 2014. That's when the war started. And between 2014 and 2021, there was fighting the whole time, but the US put in billions of dollars of weaponry. And the Ukrainians built fortifications along this line that we're seeing the front line. That didn't just start a few months ago. That was 8 years of fortifying the eastern Ukraine with American finance and know-how and weaponry. So at the end of 2021, after Biden had come into office, Putin said, look, you crossed every red line, but our red line is NATO stops its enlargement. You stop trying to get military bases on our borders. You stop putting weapon systems that can hit us in a few minutes, and we discuss it. And the White House answer was, nothing to discuss. And we're certainly not going to talk about NATO enlargement. And then the war, the invasion came on February 24th, 2022. So if ever there was a series of missed opportunities over 30 years to avoid a conflict, this is it. And that's why I'm deeply unimpressed by an analysis that said this war started on February 24th, 2022 by an unprovoked attack by President Putin. It's just not true. It started because of a buildup of conflict over a 30-year period and lots of cheating, I'm afraid, by the United States side. And that brings us to our mess right now.
So we are, Jeff, where we are right now, and obviously this angle is something that is fiercely opposed by official capital views of the European Union and Washington as well. But the fact of life is that set of very harsh economic sanctions were imposed on the Russian Federation unilaterally by the United States and the European Union. And as both economist and intellectual, what's your take on these sanctions, how effective?
Those are opposites, by the way, economist and intellectual.
Intellectual. Well,
Just to make the point.
try to be both in answering this, but and why do you think that majority of nations don't seem to have been ready to support this course of action, at least not so far?
First, on the sanctions, you know, the United States uses sanctions a lot. It's an interesting policy. They use it a lot because it's without any direct budget outlay, and it can do a lot of damage. And it doesn't require any public debate. It doesn't require any congressional approval. The public doesn't even understand what it is, but who cares? It's not their business. This is purely the president by signing a document. And the U.S. uses these unilateral sanctions. This is different from sanctions approved by the UN. That's a different matter, because the Security Council can vote sanctions under the UN Charter. But this is the U.S. using its sanctions, and they do it a lot. The one thing I would observe about this is they almost never work in geopolitical terms. And I've watched for years the use of sanctions by the U.S. as a cheap, easy policy fail time and again. One was the United States, in one of the most ridiculous foreign policy moves you can imagine, suddenly decided under Trump to declare that the president of Venezuela wasn't the president, but the president that the United States said was the president. So the United States one day announced, Maduro is not president, Guaido is president. It's in English we would say pretty ballsy. That you just announce one day who the other country's president actually is. It's a strange kind of foreign policy. Anyway, they said, okay, since Maduro's not president, he can't have any access to foreign exchange reserves anymore. He can't Venezuela won't be allowed to fix its oil drilling and so forth. So by stroke of a pen, they put on these unilateral sanctions. It actually worked in one sense. It completely crushed the Venezuelan economy, which declined by more than 50% in GDP, extraordinary decline. What didn't work is Maduro's still there, of course. And Guaido, by the way, was thrown out even by the opposition, saying, no, he's not our president anymore. The whole thing was absurd. It was worse than a high school play, actually. Oh, you're not student council president, he is. Yeah, but he won the vote. No, it doesn't matter. But anyway, they did this, but it didn't work geopolitically. It didn't end Maduro's government. In fact, in a way, he said, look, all this economic crisis caused by the gringos in the north, which was pretty accurate description, after all. It was the United States that did this. So now, by the way, the White House sends its emissaries to Maduro. Would you pump more oil? Because we have to replace the Russian oil. So now they're trying to become buddies with Maduro again. But the point is, it didn't work. And no U.S. sanctions regime that I know of in recent years has come close to working. So that's the starting point. So as soon as the U.S. put on sanctions on Russia, I talked to a very senior official and I said, this isn't going to work. It doesn't work. This time it was worse though, because not only did it not cripple the Russian economy, the boomerang effect, which didn't apply in Venezuela so much, because you could crush Venezuela without the whole world feeling it, applied in the case of Russia, which is it's led to tremendous global negative consequences. So it didn't stop Russia from exporting all over the world. And I'll come to your question, why? But it also hurt Europe a lot because Europe's told, no, you can't buy the low-cost energy that your industry has built upon. So the effects were quite serious, and we haven't seen the last of those effects yet. But when the sanctions were imposed, it was the US and always the Anglo-Saxon world, so that's the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. That's a block of the security system of the US. Then the EU, okay? Then Japan, Korea, and Singapore. That's basically it. That's roughly 20% or so of the world population, roughly speaking. Maybe a little bit less, actually. And most of the rest of the world said, we don't want to get into this. We trade with Russia, we trade with Ukraine. We're not party to this conflict. We think this conflict should stop with negotiations. And so most of the world does not want this. Of course, a lot of the world's afraid of the US secondary sanctions, but the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with these sanctions and doesn't even agree with the idea that any country can just decide to impose these sanctions, which are illegal in international law, after all. There's no legal basis for one country to say, stop trading with all those other countries. You can't do that. But they're a little afraid, but they don't impose the sanctions. This is the basic reason why Russian economy has done fine during the past year, because China trades with Russia, India trades with Russia, all the Asian countries trade with Russia, the Latin American countries trade with Russia. Today, Chancellor Scholz has been in South America, and he's being told by the South American leaders, don't pull us into this. We're not going to send arms to Ukraine. They trade with Russia, but they also trade with Ukraine, by the way. They don't want to be in this proxy war. So that's the main reason. And they don't view it like the US thought automatically they would view it, that this is an unprovoked attack. I speak to world leaders all over the world, and they understand full well this is a confrontation of two superpowers, not one side launching a war. And they want both sides to back off. So that's the answer.
So that is my next question. We're obviously in a very dangerous situation. This had very negative effect with the world economy, probably not as negative for Russia as the West had initially expected, but it's definitely a bad thing, causing global inflation, disrupting global chains and all that. We're going to get into that in a moment. But just to finish off the war section, what do you believe needs to be done under the circumstances? Who, in your opinion, should provide leadership for this tragedy to be brought to a halt?
I believe that in December 2021, the way that this war would have been avoided was 3 steps. One was Ukraine's neutrality, so non-NATO, neutral, number 1. Number 2, that Russia would continue to hold Crimea, whether by agreement or de facto. Russia views Crimea as a particular matter of national security for a true reason, which is that since 1783, that's the place of its naval base in the Black Sea, and that is central to Russia's national security. And I think that that's true. And the third was that the Minsk II agreement to address the Donbass would be implemented. And the Minsk II agreement came in 2014 and 2015, after the events of 2014, to give autonomy to the Donbass. And that's where the heavy Russian-speaking population is, and that's the site of the war right now. And the idea was that there would be some kind of constitutional autonomy, and this was signed by Ukraine and guaranteed by Germany and France in the so-called Normandy process. It was never implemented. My Ukrainian counterparts tell me, of course we would never implement that. We signed it, yes, but we would never implement it. A few weeks ago, former Chancellor Merkel, who was a guarantor of the agreement, she said, I don't even know whether it's true now what she said or what she said then. She said, no, it was a holding period to allow Ukraine to strengthen itself. We didn't expect it to be implemented, which is a remarkable statement to make because Germany was a guarantor of the agreement. That means that they're supposed to ensure that it's implemented. Whatever the case, those three positions that Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 made sense. They really made sense because not expanding NATO, in my view, is not a concession, it's common sense. Do you actually really want to provoke a conflict or do you want to keep a safe space? I say keep a safe space. So that one wasn't a concession, that just made sense to me. Crimea makes sense to me also, I have to say, that fighting to take it back could lead us to nuclear war, and we should understand the practicalities of this. And what Yanukovych was trying to do in 2011 was to negotiate a long-term lease arrangement with Russia that would last at least till 2041. Well, that would have been smart, but he was under a lot of Western pressure. And then Minsk II, sign, implemented. Well, we turned down that basis. So everything got worse. Everything's worse. Not only have hundreds of thousands of people died, we don't know how many, and massive destruction by now, but Russia annexed 4 regions. Okay, this makes it a lot harder. We don't even know what diplomacy would exactly mean right now. But to my mind, we remain 3 core issues. And the core issues are neutrality or NATO enlargement is one issue. The second issue is Crimea. And the third issue is Donbass, but unfortunately now with the Kherson region and Zaporozhye region thrown into this terrible mix. But what does it mean? In my view, it means that what this war is about is politics. It's not about some crazy, it's not about, in my opinion, Putin thinking he's Peter the Great. It's not about the Western propaganda. It's not about Hitler in 1938. It's actually about NATO and Ukraine and all these issues which have been on the table for 30 years. So we should face them politically. And this is, I think, what Clausewitz meant by his most famous expression, that war is politics with other means. In other words, we're still dealing with politics. So we need to have a political discussion about this right now.
So you mentioned in one of your recent articles that neutral countries, including those of the Global South, can play an important role in this. Again, the world has changed tremendously since the beginning of this latest era and of history, and so on and so forth. So you have a different global layout when it comes to economic power. And G7 is on the one hand, and then you have BRICS and the rest of the Global South. So how do you see the role of the Global South, and BRICS in particular, in balancing out the future of world, both security and economy?
My view is that the whole world plays a role in ending this conflict for one very basic reason. If the world really subscribed to the American and European narrative, that this is an unprovoked war, that there are no issues, that Russia just needs to leave, and that it's horrendous crimes and so forth, if that were the view around the world, the whole world would have joined in the sanctions, and Russia really would not have been able to carry on a war. It wouldn't have changed the regime and so forth, as I mentioned, even with Maduro. But Russia has been able to do what it does because it's got friends all over the world that don't subscribe to the dominant EU-US narrative. They think everybody agrees with them, but that's basically because they listen to themselves. They're not talking with the rest of the world. I am talking with a lot of world leaders who say, yeah, this is a contest between the US and Russia. We don't want to take sides in that. So my point has always been, at least make it clear that this is not a war about NATO enlargement, is what I've said to the US, for example, from December 2021 onward. Say NATO isn't enlarging, and that if Putin invades, there's no provocation for that. Make it clear. No, we won't make it clear. The door is open. It's an open door policy. Well, come on. They can't even win the international support on that because it's quite logical that it is a NATO enlargement war. And they don't say, they won't admit that, or they won't deny that. They won't say anything about it. So this is my point about why these other countries. Let's get things on the record. Is the US wanting to enlarge NATO? If they had any sense at all, they would say no. It was a terrible idea in 2008, and we understand it's a terrible idea. It crosses the red line of a major power that has 1,700 nuclear weapons, thank you. It wasn't such a good idea. So just like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a compromise to create some space, exactly the way the crisis was solved 60 years ago. If they said that, and there were negotiations that made all of this clear, and the whole rest of the world said, you know, now this makes sense, and we will hold accountable the party that breaks this agreement, then you're talking, because then just willfully invading the other side in complete contradiction to what you've agreed really would provoke a worldwide storm. And that's what I'm basically proposing, which is that there are plenty of countries that are ready to guarantee an agreement, and countries that matter. And let me take the case of China, for example. What is China's position on this war? China does not want this war. Of course, China doesn't want Russia to lose this war and NATO to win, especially because, unbelievably, the Secretary General of NATO today is in Asia to try to make a NATO-Asia alliance against China. Duh. Excuse me. What does NATO stand for? North Atlantic. Does it stand for World War III? Does it stand for U.S. Expeditionary Force? No, it stands for North Atlantic. It was to guard against an invasion by the Soviet Union, which I guarantee is not going to happen because it doesn't exist anymore. So why is the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, in Korea today? Because they have no restraint. Because now NATO wants to take a position against China, which is a kind, it's really, okay, I'm coming back to your question. So what does all this mean? Put reasonable terms on the table agree on reasonable terms, and then reasonable nations will help to ensure those terms. And the reason I was mentioning China is that China has said all along, we want the war to stop, which they really do, and I talk to a lot of Chinese senior officials, but we want Russia's security interests to be respected as well. In the West, that's regarded as ludicrous, but what it really means is no NATO enlargement, which is neither ludicrous nor of uninterest to China, which doesn't like NATO exactly right now, especially since they're traipsing around East Asia to try to organize an alliance against China. So all of this is to say there are lots of important countries in the world that actually want peace. And I mentioned Argentina, Brazil, India, which is president of the G20 this year, China, South Africa. They're not warmongers. They're not anti-Ukraine. They just happen also not to be anti-Russia. And they could help to guarantee a peace. But to guarantee a peace, there has to be a clear agreement. What does each side say? The US side has to say, we will not enlarge NATO. And the Russian side has to say, we will put our troops home. Those are the 2 points. That's observable. And I think the world could help to enforce such a basic agreement.
And obviously, as you mentioned, BRICS as well, Russia's part of BRICS, but the economic equation has changed a little bit. And I found it fascinating today when you were giving this interview to our television, when you said that, I did not know that the combined output of BRICS, economic output of BRICS, is actually equal to the combined output of G7. It's an astonishing figure, which was not the case until only a few years ago. So a significant part of the world economy having the vested interest in underwriting the terms of a lasting peace. This is what you were saying. But let me
just to underscore, the G7, US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, is, according to the International Monetary Fund data, 31% of the world output. The BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is 32% of world output. Now, don't take these numbers to a decimal point, and there are lots of footnotes to add. This is using what's called purchasing power adjusted prices and so on. But the BRICS are a major part of the world, and geopolitically, really an important part of the world. And as we were discussing, for me, extremely interesting that the 3 countries in a row now, 2023, 2024, and 2025, of the G20 presidency, which is not a small thing because it's 85% of world output, those 20 countries, 19 countries plus EU, will be BRICS countries, actually. This year, India is the presidency of the G20. Next year, Brazil, and in 2025, South Africa. And last year was Indonesia. This is a different kind of world. It's not run by the G7 anymore. It's really run by a much broader group of nations, which is good. It means technology and prosperity and know-how has spread all over the world, which is exactly what we want.
Yeah, but now this gets us into a big debate in the context of this technological progress and generally these shifting geopolitical plates. There are authors, including in the last issue of The Horizons, that argue that this war is actually just a prelude, is just an entry into a much bigger and much fiercer, much more consequential competition of our times, which is the competition between the United States and China. And as a matter of fact, one of the, in my opinion, most knowledgeable Westerners about China, which is former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, also one of the frequent visitors of the CIRSD and a contributor to Horizons, wrote a fascinating piece in this issue, laying out 10 different scenarios for the future of the United States-China relationship. And quite scaringly, I must say, 8 out of those 10 scenarios envisage a war between the United States and China in our lifetime, which is possibly even more dangerous and even more consequential than the proxy war that we have been talking about so far in this conversation. So, Jeff, what is your view on the future of the U.S.-China relationship? Do you think that this decoupling is inevitable, that this trend cannot be reversed? And what's currently, after the big COVID drama that brought another dimension into this whole situation, where do you think that the U.S.-China relationship is currently going?
I'll start with, again, the same data that I mentioned earlier, but for the U.S. and China. If you measure output in China and the U.S. at what's called international prices, a common set of prices, or what's called purchasing adjusted prices, the Chinese economy is bigger than the U.S. economy. China is currently about 18% of world output, and the U.S. is about 15.5% of world output. This is a fundamental change from 40 years ago. In 1980, the U.S. was about 21% of world output, and China was about 2.5% of world output. Between 1980 and 2020, China grew at a rate of nearly 10% per year. When you have economic growth at 10% per year, it means your economy doubles in size every 7 years. So in 35 years, it doubles 5 times, or 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 32-time increase. And that's basically what happened with China. Why, by the way? Because China started incredibly poor, and it caught up to a significant extent. When you're poor, there's lots of headroom. Electrification, education, building roads, building rail, and that's what China did extremely effectively for 40 years. Excellent economic management for 40 years. And now, they didn't close the gap in living standards, because the living standards, by this measure that I keep referring to, puts China at about 30% of the U.S. level. But since China's 4 times the population, it makes it a larger economy in total. Well, let me just give you the upshot of this. This is freaking out American policymakers. It's what a psychologist or a psychiatrist would call a neurotic reaction, because no one gave China the permission to be bigger than the United States. And that wasn't supposed to happen. In 1992, the U.S. achieved unipolar status, the sole superpower. And that was supposed to last for many decades. And lo and behold, 30 years later, it ended. And the American reaction is, we are so smart, we are so good, we are so effective, that China must really have cheated at every moment. And they really must be our enemy also. This is extremely dangerous. It's either us or them at the top of the world. And only a US-led world is a safe world. Otherwise, we're all going to be destroyed by China. It is, in my view, a fantasy misunderstanding. I'll start again with the basic proposition. China's living standards are about a third of the US. China has decades of economic development to make. China faces major challenges. Population is now starting to decline quite significantly. China will probably be under 1 billion people by the end of this century, possibly 800 million, according to the UN forecasts, which are mechanical, but still showing how significant. China will age very rapidly. There are many, many challenges. China's not out to take over the world. But the U.S. whole vision is U.S. is the world leader. It's the self-image. It's what I'm afraid is taught at the Kennedy School of Government often. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it was
something like that.
It was in a different.
You don't have to believe what's
context.
taught, but it is something that's taught.
I actually did believe a lot of things that I was taught at Harvard Kennedy School, and this is one of the reasons why Jeff and I remain so close up to this day. But the atmosphere was different back at a school. It was easier to disagree. It was a different era. I really enjoyed my time at a very liberal and open institution that was Harvard at the time. I did give a lecture last year at Harvard, and although it wasn't really about the war in Ukraine, I was asked questions by the audience, by the kids in the audience, and I was very diplomatic. I wasn't like Jeff at all. Tonight, Jeff was very open.
They probably wouldn't invite me there. So
yeah, but, I mean, later on, I remember we went for a lunch, the professor and I. I'm not going to name who the professor was, but she. That's
a disguise.
That's a little bit of a disguise. We sat in Harvard Square, and she was whispering at me, saying, "Oh, you should not have said what you said."
Oh my word!
And I said, like, I mean, I did not want to make a comment on that, but whispering in a restaurant at Harvard Square, like whispering, I could imagine whispering, in a place like Belgrade or maybe a place like Moscow, whispering so they do not overhear what you say. But whispering at Harvard Square was something that really struck me, that there was an era of change in comparison to the time when I was at Harvard. I had so many other questions to ask, but I'm not even going to go into the origins of the COVID virus. I'm not going to go into the questions of who blew up the Nord Stream, because it would have been too much of me to ask under the circumstances. But I do want to give, every time, I do want to give a chance to the audience to ask questions to Professor Sachs. He has to leave the podium at 6:55 because he has a brief phone call to make. So it gives us about 12 to 13 minutes of questions, and the floor is open indeed. This is not Harvard. This is a free place, so you can ask anything you like to Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And then Mr. I'm going to give a chance to Governor Šoškić to ask the first question. Apologies to you guys in the back. Former governor of the Central Bank of Serbia.
Great.
Mr. Šoškić.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was a pleasure to listen to your points. My question would be the following one. If we assume that this conflict is going to end in a way that's not going to be a defeat, an explicit defeat of Russia, do you see that having any consequences of the future role of dollar as an international currency? And what do you think is going to happen on the U.S. Treasury bond market in the future? Thank you.
Just in a general word about the role of the U.S. dollar. It has been a source of a lot of U.S. power and prerogative, the fact that about 60% of world trade is denominated in dollars and settled in dollars, and the U.S. banking system is the predominant mechanism for clearing transactions. And the SWIFT system, which is how the U.S. banking system settles transactions, is the instrument by which the U.S. excludes Russia, for example, under the sanctions. I believe that in 10 years from now, the role of the dollar will be much, much less than it is today. And in 20 years, we'll have a very different international monetary system. And the U.S. will have lost what was called by de Gaulle an exorbitant privilege, but it will have lost a privilege of having the key currency in the world. I think there are three reasons for this decline that will come, that's already underway. One is that to be the world currency depends on being the predominant economy in the world. And as the U.S. share of the world economy diminishes, it's natural that the role of the U.S. dollar would diminish as well. And we are, as I said, on a gradual, gentle decline, not gentle, but gradual decline of the share of world output due to the U.S., not mainly because of the U.S. collapse, but mainly because the rest of the world develops economically, like China. So that's one reason. The second reason is much more pertinent to this evening, and that is the U.S. began to weaponize the dollar roughly a decade ago. So it basically began to use the dollar as a geopolitical instrument. And my advice is, if you are a government that isn't getting along too well with the U.S., hold your reserves in some other currency. Because the U.S. has developed a bad habit of seizing foreign exchange reserves of governments that it doesn't like. And it has done that with Venezuela, with Iran, with Afghanistan, with North Korea, and now with Russia. It views that as an easy thing to do. Stroke of a pen by the president, and your antagonist, your foe, can't use their dollars anymore. We even did that with Afghanistan on the way out, froze all the foreign exchange reserves so that the economy completely collapsed in that impoverished place afterwards. It's nasty, by the way. But more than being nasty, it also is not something you can do over and over again, because other countries start to say, maybe we'll hold our reserves in renminbi, thank you, or maybe we'll hold them in some other currency, thank you. And that's what's happening now. So that's a second reason for why the dollar will decline, because it's not just a money, it's an instrument of geopolitics, which it should not be. You can have one or the other, but you can't have the geopolitical instrument for very long. You won't have the key currency anymore. And the third is technological. I think that transactions will not be settled through commercial banks in the future in anything like the way they are now, because we will have digital central bank currencies, and we don't need the commercial banks in the long term to settle our transactions. Probably the digital renminbi will be a first digital currency, probably for use within China, but then it will start to be expanded internationally. Several other central banks will make digital currencies. This is quite different from crypto. Crypto is you have an electronic account that's nonsense, and you think it's going to hold value. It's every day I wake up, sorry to say if you're Bitcoin lovers, every day that Bitcoin has any value at all, I think the world's still crazy. So Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, and it's not a legal reserve currency for anything, and it's not a legal means of payment, and it's not a national fiat currency which can at least settle your debts internally. It's unbelievable that people spend money for this electronic cipher. And this arrest of this kid in the United States should tell you this is a little crazy. But what I'm talking about is something else, which is a central bank currency, because there, a digital central bank currency is just a means of clearing payments rather than writing checks like we used to do, or even making electronic ledgers through Venmo we use in the United States and so forth, whichever e-wallet system you use. The central bank can do that, actually. And I think that we'll go to that kind of settlements. And so the U.S. ability to say, we're going to cut you off from SWIFT, so what? So I think in 10 years or 15 years from now, it'll be quite a different international monetary system.
Thank you. One other question, back in the audience.
Good evening. I'm Andrei, a student of international relations. It's really a pleasure to listen to you again. I was in the audience last time you were in Serbia. And my question is, what is your vision of the role of Russia in the future in the conflict of US and China? Thank you very much.
The role of
Russia in the conflict between the U.S. and China.
The role of Russia in the conflict? Yes. Look, basically, much of the world, as I say, is going to have trade relations with China because why not? It's a good trading partner. And China will be the world's main trading partner for a significant majority of the world. And Russia is among them, and physically being neighbors so that Russia can make gas and oil pipelines and provide other raw materials which China doesn't have, makes them very complementary economies. And since the U.S. has designated both of them as enemies, it makes them natural allies. We did the one thing that Zbigniew Brzezinski said never do. Zbigniew Brzezinski was, the geopolitical strategist who in 1997 said how important Ukraine was for this geopolitical competition. But in his book, The Global Chessboard, he says, well, this will be the geographical pivot of Eurasia, but the one thing the United States must never do is drive China and Russia together. And then he says, but this is very unlikely to happen. And so, it's the U.S., you shouldn't declare enemies this way. It doesn't even make sense on your own terms of your own geopolitical competition. And that was Nixon's idea of triangulating between Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, during the Cold War period. But we did what we were told, that will never happen because it's such a bad idea. So right now, that is a friendship without limits, as they say, because the U.S. is targeting both of them. And the U.S. is talking the European Union into more and more of an anti-China policy. And I just can't believe it that Europe would fall for this. Because Europe, absolutely for its prosperity, needs a good relationship with China. And for a long time in the future, China will be a neighbor of Europe in Eurasia. And so you're actually on the same landmass, too. And so having good relations would be a good thing, but not in the U.S. mindset. And so the U.S. has launched a chips war against China. This is incredible, this chips war, oh my God. I need an hour to say what I wanted to say, but I'll say it in 1 minute.
There's one more question.
The U.S. has said we're going to try to stop the Chinese economy from, modernizing at the front level by restricting the sale of advanced chips. Terrible idea in my view. Completely belligerent. But yesterday, apparently, according to the Financial Times, I don't know whether it's definitive or not, Netherlands said we go along with this. If Europe just follows the U.S. on this, it's not going to defeat China, but it sure is going to boomerang against Europe. It makes no sense. And what Europe should be saying to the United States is, calm down. You're still powerful. We still like you. You don't have to, you're still richer than China per capita. You can calm down. We don't want a war with China too. And that's what Europe should really be saying to the United States for its own good.
Thank you, Jeff. But there's one more question, and I really have to make an exception, because I really don't know what would have happened if I don't allow this. But my wife actually wants to ask a question. It catches me by surprise. So Natasha Jeremić wants to ask a question.
What is the current situation of climate change, 2020?
Okay, an easy question. Current situation on climate change. It's hot and getting hotter fast. And just to give you a couple of grim realities on this, the rate of warming of Earth on average has been 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade during the last 30 years. So that means that Earth has warmed by about half of 1 degree C over the past 30 years. Earth is now warming currently at about twice that rate, at about 0.36 degrees Celsius per decade. Now, compared to the pre-industrial temperature, the Earth is 1.2 degrees warmer than it was before industrialization. If you take 0.36 degrees C per decade, that means we'll be 1.56 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial 10 years from now. That means we will be above the limit set in the Paris Agreement within 10 years. And according to my favorite climatologist, Dr. James Hansen, who I've relied on for decades, and he's been right on everything he's told me for decades, he thinks that in the next few years, when we go from the La Nina cycle in the Pacific Ocean to an El Nino, which raises the Earth's temperature on what's called an interannual basis, we could have an excess beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Paris limit, within the next 5 years, the next big El Nino. We're in a La Nina right now. All of this is to say, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any doubt at all about global warming, it's real, it's serious, it's accelerating, and it's going to create a terrible mess no matter what we do. But if we don't do what we need to do, it's going to create a catastrophic mess. Thank you.
Anna, I gotta thank you very much. I gotta end on the positive note. There is a cocktail, and the drinks are on the CIRSD. We have to end on a positive note. Jeff is going to leave us right now for a call, but he's gonna come back and join us in some 20 minutes to half an hour. Thank you once again, Jeff. This was fascinating. Not everybody agreed, I'm sure, with everything that you had said, but